Okay.
All right. Greetings and welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast about women and women first. My name is Sovereign Syre. I'm a writer, a comedian, and America just got a new dad, Tim Waltz. And I'm happy about my new dad.
He's a good one.
That speech last night was like a masterclass. I was like, this is like a 50-state win. They're inventing new states to turn blue right now.
I haven't heard the speech yet, but I've read some takeaways from it.
YouTube it. I was watching it last night and I was like, is this, am I hopeful? Am I hopeful for America? Like, what's going on?
It's weird to feel that and not feel like you're being set up, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I'm Ela Darling, a VR pioneer, a former librarian, and erstwhile, current, sometimes library volunteer, which feels very good to be in a library again. And a denizen of the trees. Kind of similar to last week, but it still feels relevant.
Yeah.
Now, we here at Ill Repute support women's rights, but more importantly,
we support women's wrongs.
Now, Sav, which women's wrongs are we writing today?
Today, we are writing the story of Juana Maria, the last Nicoleno tribal member, but not really. If you have not listened to the previous episode, we told the story of Juana Maria, who was abandoned, the last of her tribe, lived alone for 18 years on the island of San Nicolas, 60 miles off the coast of Santa Barbara. And today we are going to talk about what happened to her story and why we should care and what it teaches us about colonization.
So where were we with Juana?
So Juana, where we left, had been rescued, quote unquote, by a white sea otter hunter in 1853 who brought her back to civilization. So we begin. By 1880, the story of the lone woman had become part of California local legend. There was a fascination with the plight of the last woman of a tribe, living in solitude for nearly 20 years before being rescued by white men and brought back to civilization. The narrative around the lone woman had been completely manicured to fit a white savior, vanishing Indian myth of manifest destiny and American colonial exceptionalism. Here we will read part of the article written by Emma C. Hardiker that appeared in Scripps, which was a Presbyterian literary journal that was was big deal. Mm-hmm. She wrote this article and it became the 1880 version of going viral. It was reprinted in all the newspapers. She had gone and dug up this story and done a very long piece about the lone woman of San Nicolas. And so we're going to read from this article and we're going to see how a narrative is being very deliberately shaped by a white author.
Quote, "In the excitement and confusion of the final abandonment of their home, it was not known until they were on the ship that a child had been left behind. The mother supposed it to have been carried aboard in the arms of an old sailor. She frantically implored the men to return. The captain replied that they must get to a place of safety. After the storm, tomorrow perhaps, they would come back for the baby." That's how babies work.
Yeah, the article goes on. Finding that they were going out to sea, the young mother became desperate and, despite all efforts to detain her, jumped overboard and struck out through the kelpy waters for the shore. She was a widow between 20 and 30 years of age, of medium height and fine form. Her complexion was light and her hair of a dark, rich brown. No attempt was made to rescue her, and in a moment she was lost in the seething waves. The ship, already under headway, staggered through the storm. The affrighted islanders huddled together on deck, and fear shut every other emotion for the time from their hearts.
After an adventurous voyage, the peor es nada eventually reached San Pedro, where the exiles were landed. Some of them were sent to Los Angeles, 15 miles back from the coast. Some were put to work in the neighboring mission of San Gabriel. 2 of the women were soon married to wealthy men of Los Angeles.
So here
I'm
is
so glad
glossed
their
over.
romance budded so quickly.
Yeah. So here is glossed over the sexual trafficking of 2 women to the wealthy white men of California, which gives credence to the version of the story that says the reason the men arrived to remove the Nicolenos from the island was because another white visitor to the island had absconded with a young woman, and other men were keen to also get their hands on a sexual slave. Because there are many versions of the story, but the one that says a guy went there, absconded with the girl, and then told his friends they should go get themselves some more. This telling of the story seems to lend credence to that, yeah, they were taken from the island to be conscripted into slavery. It also glossed over the purpose of the missions for wanting Nicolenos to put them into slavery, which it appears was the fate of all the men. The article continues.
It was the intention of Captain Hubbard to return to San Nicolas immediately to see if the woman or child were living. But the schooner had orders to come direct to Santa Barbara to take George Nidever. Is that how we're saying his name?
Yeah.
To take George Nidever and a party of otter hunters to Santa Rosa Island. Afterward, carry from Monterey a cargo of timber to San Francisco. The boat was in urgent demand along the coast, and these 2 trips were imperative before a second visit could be made to San Nicolas. Delaying their errand of humanity and justice a few weeks, they lost it forever. For on that very trip, the Peoras Nada capsized at the entrance to the Golden Gate. The men were washed ashore in an almost exhausted condition, and the schooner drifted out to sea. It was reported long after, though without confirmation, to have been picked up by a Russian ship.
The article goes on. After the loss of the Monterey schooner, there was no craft of any kind larger than the canoes and fishing boats on the lower coast. No one cared to attempt a passage of 70 miles to San Nicolas in an open boat. And after a time, the excitement and interest faded out. Those who at first had been most solicitous that assistance should be sent settled into the belief that the couple had perished during the days of waiting. The remainder of the community, never having believed that the woman had reached shore through the storm, were indifferent, supposing that the child had died soon after the tragic death of the mother.
Here again, the slander of the Nicolenos, suggesting that they did not care about their community members who had been abandoned. Because, of course, that's the narrative. Further, the suggestion that no other boats could be sent to the island is untrue. From earlier, more contemporary accounts, we know at least once a year ships touched on the island to hunt, and it was not uncommon to encounter this woman. And she seemed to have no desire to be disrupted, or perhaps her fear of white men was founded on abuse that she suffered at the hands of these men when they arrived on the island. There's really any number of reasons why she wouldn't want fuck all to do with these people.
Yeah. The article continues. Their uncertain fate lay heavy on the more tender-hearted of the mission fathers. But it was not until 1850 that Father Gonzalez found an emissary to search for the lost. Thomas Jeffries had come into possession of a small schooner and was offered $200 should he find and bring the woman or child to Santa Barbara alive. 15 years having passed since the abandonment of the island, and no one having visited the spot during that time, the probability of the death of the parties was universally accepted, although no actual proof of death had been sought or found.
But when Thomas Jeffries' boat was seen at the close of a balmy day of midwinter, coming up the bay without the signal he was to have displayed, provided his search had been successful, the matter was settled. Groups of persons congregated on the sands. Some watched from shore the small craft fold her wings and settle to rest on the mirror-like water. Others put off in canoes to meet the boatmen and gossip concerning the trip. Jeffries had found no trace of living beings on the island, and whether the woman had been beaten to death in the surf or died after gaining the land would probably never be known. The schooner was left idly rocking close to shore. Sailors and landsmen strolled slowly up to the town. Night mantled the moaning waters, and the great deep was left in possession of another secret.
The article continues. The return of Jeffries brought up afresh the incident which, by some, had been almost forgotten. For a few hours, little was talked of saving the heroic young mother and her child in the sea-girt isle. Time passed swiftly on, and in the dreamy, full contentment of the land, the dead woman of San Nicolas slipped from mind and thought and speech, unquote.
Again, this was untrue. There were multiple newspaper reports about the very much living lone woman of San Nicolas throughout this period. Everyone knew that she was, in fact, very much alive. The article continues, picking up at George Nivender's expedition to the island for seal hunting. Here, the story draws out a long hunt for the woman, as though they are scientists on an expedition for an animal. There are tropes never before heard of, wherein, when they find her, she's surrounded by wild dogs.
So we're moving ahead in the article. It's a very long article. In July 1853, the Ottermen made a third trip to San Nicolas, anchored off the northeast side, and established a camp on shore. The party consisted of Captain Nidever, a fisherman named Carl Detman, who went among sailors by the sobriquet of Charlie Brown, an Irish cook, and a crew of Mission Indians. And Mission Indians is important here because these were all different tribes, and they got thrown into the mission system, put through Catholic school, and then they just became Mission Indians. It's like the completely stripping away of any of the specificity of like where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
I digress. As Brown drew nearer, a pack of dogs reclining close to the woman growled. But without looking around, the woman uttered a peculiar cry which silenced them, and they ran away to the hills. Brown halted within a few yards of her and, himself unseen, watched every movement within the hut. Inside the enclosure was a mound of grass, woven baskets full of things, and a rude knife made of a piece of iron hoop thrust into a wooden handle. A fire smoldered near, and a pile of bones lay in the ashes. The complexion of the woman was much fairer than the ordinary Indian. Her personal appearance pleasing, features regular, her hair thick and brown, falling about her shoulders in a tangled mat.
Oh, that sentence contained so much. She's very pretty because she looks more white than we expected her to. And her features, they're almost normal. Oh my gosh.
It's so bad.
Christ. From the time Brown arrived within hearing, she kept up a continual talking to herself. She was leaning forward, shading her eyes with her hand, watching the men crossing the flat below her dwelling. After looking at them with an anxiety impossible to be depicted, she crouched in terror, but immediately started up as if to run. The men on the flat had not seen her, and Brown, putting his hat on the ramrod of his gun, alternately lifted and lowered it to attract their attention. Then, by signs, he intimated that the woman was found, and they should spread out so as to catch her if she tried to escape. Before the men reached the knoll, Brown stepped around in sight and spoke. Jesus.
Yeah.
If you're trying to keep her from escaping, you're not a humanitarian.
Yeah, exactly. The article goes on. She gave a frightened look into his face, ran a few steps, but instantly controlling herself, stood still and addressed him in an unknown tongue. She seemed to be between 40 and 50 years of age, in fine physical condition, erect, with well-formed neck and arms and unwrinkled face. She was dressed in a tunic-shaped garment made of bird's plumage, low on the neck, sleeveless and reaching to the ankle. The dress was similar to the one found in the tree. Earlier in the article, they find some of her shit. As the men came up, she greeted them, each in the way she had met Brown, and with a simple dignity, not without its effect on both Indians and white men, made them welcome and set about preparing food for them from her scanty store. The meal consisted of roasted roots, called by Californians carcamides. But when was there known a more touching hospitality? Unquote.
Aww. This just reeks of she thinks she's people.
Yeah.
Here we have the noble savage trope coming into play. The article continues. Among the Indian crew, there were several dialects spoken, but none of the party were able to converse with their hostess or understand a word she uttered, and they were forced to try and make her know by signs that she was expected to go with them. Brown went through the motion of packing her things in baskets, shouldering them, and walking toward the beach. She comprehended instantly and made preparations to depart. Her effects were neatly placed in packed baskets, one of which she swung over her back, and taking a burning stick from the fire, she started with a firm tread after the Indians to the shore.
The article goes on. Beside the load the female Crusoe carried, Nidover and Brown had their arms full. Upon reaching the boat, she entered without hesitation, going forward to the bow, kneeling and holding to either side. When the schooner was reached, she went aboard without any trouble, sat down near the stove in the cabin, and quietly watched the men in their work on board. To replace her feather dress, which he wished to preserve, Brown made her a petticoat of ticking, and with a man's cotton shirt and gay neckerchief, her semi-civilized dress was complete. Yeah, we're going to take your badass haute couture, seabird plumed, hand beaded, neck to heel moment, and we're going to give you trash.
Mhm.
Trash.
What is ticking? A petticoat of ticking.
Ticking is like canvas, just like a generic kind of fabric you would have to like repair sails and things like that. Just ticking is just any kind of it's usually like a white or off-white kind of just fabric that is like sort of multi-purpose.
This sounds like the outfit that you would buy if you had nothing but $7 on 50% off Red Tag Day at Goodwill.
Yeah.
And you had to not be naked. While Brown was sewing, she watched him closely and laughed at his manner of using a needle. Good. She showed him that her way was to puncture the cloth with her bone needle, or awl, and then put the thread through the perforations. She signified that she wished to try a threaded needle, and Brown good-naturedly gave her sewing materials, but she could not thread the needle. Brown prepared it and gave her an old cloak of Nidover's to mend, and while she took her first lesson in sewing, she told her teacher on shipboard by signs portions of her life on the island.
Okay, so this is where the narrative really starts to take shape with the trope of quote-unquote telling by signs. As anyone can imagine, using gestures and pointing to tell a story is pretty much impossible. It gives the interpreter a blank slate to fill in with details whatever he wishes.
Yeah.
So the article continues.
She had from time to time seen ships pass, but none came to take her off. She watched as long as she could see them, and after they were out of sight, she threw herself on the ground and cried. But after a time, she walked over the island until she forgot about it and could smile again. She had also seen people on the beach several times. She was afraid and hid until they were gone, and then wept because she had not made herself known.
Again, how this sophisticated emotional narrative was told through gestures alone boggles the mind. All that, that's a pretty emotionally sophisticated narrative to
gesture.
Yeah.
It's not like she's speaking sign language.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm not picking up what this writer is putting down. No. So again, the article continues.
She said that he had taken her by surprise and she could not run, and she was glad because he would take her to her people. Her people had gone away with white men in a ship. Brown understood by her signs that at the time of the desertion of the island, she had a nursing baby, which she represented by sucking her finger and placing her arm in position of holding an infant at the breast. She waved her hand over the sea to indicate that the ship sailed away, calling back mañana, tomorrow. Then she could not find her child and wept until she was very ill and lay prostrate for days in a bed of plants resembling cabbage and called by Californians sola santa. She had nothing to eat but the leaves. When she revived somewhat, she crawled to a spring, and after a time, as her strength returned, she made fire by rapidly rubbing a pointed stick along the groove of a flat stick until a spark was struck. It was a difficult task, and she was careful not to let her fire go out. She took brands with her on trips and covered the home fire with ashes to preserve it. 1 second.
That's a lot of signs and gestures. That is a lot of information to convey with grunts and points.
Yeah.
Just like, come on. Okay. The article continues. Keep in mind, this is all being communicated with gestures and noises. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
She lived during her captivity on fish, seal's blubber, roots, and shellfish, and the birds whose skins she secured for clothing were seabirds, which she caught at night off their roosts in the seams of the crags. The bush enclosures she made for a screen from the winds and as a protection while asleep from wild animals. She made frequent excursions over the island from her main dwelling, which was a large cave on the north end of San Nicolas. She kept dried meat at each camping station. The food in the crevices by the springs was for the time when, from sickness or old age, she would only be able to crawl to the water and live on what she had there stored out of reach of the dogs.
That the woman had faith in a supreme power was evinced soon after the schooner set sail from the fishing grounds. A gale overtook them, and the passenger made signs that she would stop the wind. With her face turned in the direction from which the storm came, she muttered words of prayer until the wind had abated, then turned with a beaming countenance and motioned that her petition had been answered. Okay.
The article goes on. They anchored under the lee of Santa Cruz, where the woman was highly interested in seeing another island than her own. When they approached the shores of Santa Barbara, an ox team passed along the beach. The stranger was completely bewildered. Captain Nidover's son, who had been on the lookout for his father's sail, rode down to the landing on a handsome little bronco. The islander, who had just stepped ashore, was wild with delight. She touched the horse and examined the lad, talking rapidly and, if the sailors turned away, calling to them to come back and look. Then she tried to represent the novel sight by putting 2 fingers of her right hand over the thumb of her left, moving them to imitate the horse walking.
Captain Nidover conducted the woman to his home and put her in charge of his Spanish wife. The news spreading, Father Gonzalez of Santa Barbara Mission came to see her. Many persons gathered from the ranches round about, and the house was crowded constantly. The brig Fremont came into port soon after, and the captain offered Nidover the half of what he would make if he would allow her to be exhibited in San Francisco. This offer was refused, and also another from a Captain Trussell. Mrs. Nidover would not hear of the friendless creature being made a show for the curious. Well, that sounds almost compassionate.
Yeah.
Almost. I don't know.
Well, that's the Spanish woman that's probably herself a bride, so, you know.
Yeah, good point.
Like, yeah, just go watch The West and the section on California, Mexico history. Like, anyway, the article continues. The bereft mother evinced the greatest fondness for Mrs. Nidover's children, caressing and playing with them by the hour and telling the lady, by signs, that when she swam back to the shore, her baby was gone, and she believed the dogs had eaten it. She went over again and again, her grief at its loss, her frantic search for it, even after it had been gone a long time, her dread of being alone, her hope for years of rescue, and at last the despair that in time became resignation. Wow. She must have the ability to use her grunts and gestures to convey so much information. Is just really so remarkable. I mean, just
how
wow,
is that not
you
the
know?
story? She's like expanding to philosophical concepts with simply hand gestures. Also, they keep calling her child an it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was just how they wrote at the time, but
No. That's how they wrote about Injuns, savages. That's how they wrote about, you know, the half beasts, the uncivilized, etc. You know, almost like us, almost. See, it's like looking into the face of time itself, from whence we came. It's like, the fuck? This is how I talk about the first time that I saw a manatee. Like, you know what I mean? I dove in the water, the baby manatee, like it came right up to me. And I was like, oh, it's like time. I can see where we all came from. This is how we came out of the water. Anyway.
The article continues. The visitors sometimes gave her presents, which she put aside until the donors had departed, seeming to know by intuition that they would be offended if she refused to accept them. But as soon as the guests were gone, she called the little children and distributed her gifts among them, laughing if they were pleased and happy in their joy. A few days after her arrival, Father Antonio Jimenez sent for Indians from the missions of San Fernando and Santa Ysaiz in hope of finding someone who could converse with the islander. At that time, there were Indians living in Los Angeles County, belonging to the Pepemaros, who it was said had in former years communication with the San Nicolas Indians. But neither these nor those from San Buenaventura or Santa Barbara could understand her or make themselves understood. In less than 2 decades after the little band had left San Nicolas, their whereabouts could not be discovered.
So let's take a minute. Spoiler alert. It's like, have you ever been watching Unsolved Mysteries? And then you get to the end, and then it goes, update. Right. And you're like excited, like, yeah, they solved the mystery. Like, I was waiting. There were other Nicoleno members, the people that got married off, the people that were on the missions, etc., which is most likely where all of the information just got conveyed, was because it was conveyed to someone that could understand her. This sophisticated narrative came from her speaking in her language to someone else that spoke her language. And again, just reminder that in the first half, we went over the real story, which is all these island tribes intercommunicated with each other all the time. Even if there were no Nicoleno around, there would be natives from the other islands and among the Tongva and Chumash that through trade would still have been able to communicate with her. So, but when we're building a certain kind of narrative called the Vanishing Indian, the most famous one is Last of the Mohicans.
Mm-hmm.
You have to build a certain context. And what's more romantic than the last of her kind? No one could understand her. Alone. All those years. The last of her kind, so noble. Right? It creates in this romantic context the sense of inevitability rather than genocide. This was an inevitable consequence of the evolution of man, not a very specific and inevitable consequence of genocide.
Right.
That is very important when we're building a world in which colonialism is good and progress is mandated by God. Right?
Right.
So the article continues. They were a mere drop in the stream of serfs known by the general name of Mission Indians. That's the author talking about the Nicoleno. The Nicoleno were a mere drop in the stream of serfs known by the general name of Mission Indians. Beyond a few words, nothing was ever known of her tongue. A hide she called Tuque, a man, Nache, the sky, Tegua, the body, Penuche. She learned a few Spanish words, pan, bread, papas, potatoes, cabello, horse. Sometimes she called Captain Nidover, in Spanish, Tata, father. Sometimes Nana, mother.
The gentleness, modesty, and tact of the untutored wild woman of the Pacific were so foreign to ideas of the savage nature that some parties believed she was not an Indian, but a person of distinction, cast away by shipwreck and adopted by the islanders before their removal from their home. Others were certain, from her evident refinement, that she had not been long alone, but had drifted to San Nicolas after the Indian woman perished in the surf and had by mistake been taken for the original savage. The old sailors who rescued her affirmed that she was an Indian, the same who jumped from the schooner to save her child. The representative of a lost tribe, she stands out from the Indians of the coast, the possessor of noble and distinctive traits, provident, cleanly, tasteful, amiable, imitative, considerate, and with a maternal devotion which civilization has never surpassed.
Again, noble savage. Noble savage. We got to build it up because I'm like, this person's probably fucking terrified. What is going on, right? Like, how else is she going to act? She is like the most vulnerable a person can fucking be. Like, of course she's nice. Of course she's like all the things. Like, what else are you going to do? You're completely vulnerable to the people around you. Like, what are you going to be but passive? And
well, it goes to the fight or flight response, which has been expanded to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And she's fawning because I think that's really common for women because you don't stand much of a chance elsewhere. So you just have to be the nicest. And that elevates her to almost being a person in their eyes. So it works.
And they keep calling her fair. I included a picture of her up at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And no. She looks dark complected. She looks exactly what you would expect a native from California to look like. You know, she looks like any sort of Latina that you would encounter if you live in Southern California, like because of, that there's a very there's political boundaries between Mexico and California and what we call Native American and not, but she doesn't look like some special, different, like she looks like what she is, so you can see there's all this romanticizing of like the fairer than the others. And it's like, no, she looked like exactly what she was. And she's lovely, very lovely face. But,
Yeah, she's quite pretty, but
oh yeah, yeah.
But
you know what I
just
mean?
ripe to be projected upon by
Yeah.
her quote unquote saviors, her white
Yeah.
saviors.
Yeah.
So
the article goes on. She was greatly disappointed when none of her kindred were found. She drooped under civilization. She missed the outdoor life of her island camp. After a few weeks, she became too weak to walk. She was carried onto the porch every day in a chair. She dozed in the sunshine while the children played around her. Mrs. Nidover hoped a return to her old diet would help her. She procured seal's meat and roasted it in ashes. When the sick woman saw it, she patted her nurse's hands affectionately, but could not eat the food. She fell from her chair one morning and remained insensible for hours.
seeing the approach of death, Mrs. Nidover sent for a priest to baptize her protege. At first he refused, not knowing but that she had been baptized previously, although the burden of proof was against it. At length, heeding the kind Catholic lady's distress, he consented to administer the rite conditionally. As she was breathing her last, the sign of the cross was pressed on her cold brow, and the unknown and nameless creature was christened by Father Sanchez in the beautiful Spanish Juana Maria. In a walled cemetery from whose portals gleamed ghastly skull and crossbones, close to the Santa Barbara mission, under the shelter of the tower, is the neglected grave of a devoted mother, the heroine of San Nicolas. All right.
So, a lot to unpack there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she died within 3 weeks of arriving, and her official cause of death was dysentery.
Oh my God.
And there may have been something to that just like the radical shift in diet was like more than her body could handle, especially if they were giving her really processed foods, like that her body's just not used to processing. Like if she's living on like very limited carbs and a lot of just freshly killed meat and fat, and then if she's being fed like beans and bread and this kind of stuff, it's very easily could be that her body was, but yeah. So, and also it could be that the reason that she finally agreed to go to the mainland is that she may have already been sick and knew that she was going to die and wanted to, be around people that could take care of her, or, like who can say? So this article from Scribner's effectively cemented the narrative of Juana Maria, the last of her band, the Vanished Indian. However, her story would become a global phenomenon with the publication of the popular young adult novel, The Island of the Blue Dolphins. The book was written by Scott Odell and was published in 1960. The book is based on the story of the lone woman, but reimagines her as a young girl. And this following plot summary is from Wikipedia.
From Wikipedia. The main character is a Nicoleno girl named Juana Pale, whose secret name is Carana. She has a brother named Ramo and a sister named Ulape. Her people live in a village called Galasat, and the tribe survives by gathering roots and fishing. One day, a ship of Russian fur hunters and their Creole and Aleut workers led by Captain Orlov arrive and persuade the Nicolenos to let them hunt sea otter in exchange for other goods. However, the Russians attempt to swindle the islanders by leaving without paying. When they are confronted by Karana's father, Chief Chowig, a battle breaks out. Karana's father and many other men in the tribe die in battle against the well-armed Russians.
Later, the replacement chief, Chief Kimki, leaves the island on a canoe for new land in the east. Eventually, he sends a giant canoe to bring his people to the mainland, even though he himself does not return. The white missionaries come to Corana's village and tell them to pack their goods and go to the ship. Corana's brother Ramo runs off to retrieve his fishing spear. Although Corana urges the captain to wait for Ramo to return, the ship must leave before a storm approaches. Despite restraint, Corana jumps off the ship and swims to shore, and the ship departs without them.
While awaiting the return of the ship, Ramo is brutally killed by a pack of feral dogs. Alone on the island, Corana takes on traditionally male tasks, such as hunting, making spears, and building canoes to survive. She vows to avenge her brother's death and kills several of the dogs, but has a change of heart when she encounters the leader of the pack. She tames him and names him Rontu.
Over time, Corana makes a life for herself, even successfully hunting a giant devilfish. It's like a massive octopus or squid. With Rontu, she builds a home made of whale bones and stocks a cave with provisions in case the Aleuts come back so that she can hide from them. She also tames some birds and an otter named Monani, while feeling a close kinship to the animals, the only inhabitants of the island beside herself.
One summer, the Aleuts return and Corana takes refuge in the cave. She observes the Aleuts closely and realizes that a girl named Tutok takes care of the domestic duties, including getting water from the pool near Corana's cave. Fearful of being discovered, Corana goes out only at night, yet the curious girl stalks Corana and the two meet. Corana and Tutok exchange gifts, and she realizes how lonely she has been. The next day, Corana sees the ship with Tutok departing. Sadly, she returns to her house and starts rebuilding.
More time passes and Rontu dies. Corana soon finds a young dog that looks like Rontu and takes him, naming him Rontu Aru. One day, Corana sees the sails of a ship, but it moors offshore and leaves. 2 years later, in the spring, the boat returns. Corana dresses in her finest attire, a dress of cormorant feathers, and waits on the shore for the boat. Her rescuers make a dress for her as they believe her dress of cormorant feathers is not appropriate for the mainland. She does not like the dress, but Corana realizes that it is part of her new life. The ship takes Corana, Rontu Aru, and her two birds to the mission in Santa Barbara, California. There, Father Gonzalez tells her that the ship that had taken her tribe away had sunk before it could return to the island of the Blue Dolphins for her.
Oh, wow.
So we're seeing there's a lot of Disneyfied elements here, right? There is like a lot of very romantic ideas about what surviving off the land entails and the brutality, like making a pet otter. The bad guys are the Russians and not
the people who came and took her people and then drowned them in a shipwreck.
Yeah.
The book was wildly popular and went on to win the Newbery Prize for Literature and became a staple in elementary schools everywhere. Sovereign remembers vividly reading this book in the 5th grade and loving it. I, Ella, don't believe I ever had the chance, and it doesn't seem like I missed out on too much, except for the context for this episode. The female protagonist was an unusual feature in most literature, especially literature about survival against nature. There are several reasons why the book took off the way that it did. Survival narratives gained significant popularity in the late 1950s and early 1960s, reflecting broader cultural trends and societal interests during that time.
The Cold War era, marked by the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, instilled a pervasive sense of uncertainty and fear. The threat of nuclear war and the possibility of societal collapse made stories of survival and resilience particularly resonant. The post-World War II period emphasized individualism and self-reliance. Stories of survival mirrored values that celebrated personal strength, ingenuity, and the ability to overcome adversity. The frontier spirit, a long-standing American cultural ideal, was revived, emphasizing rugged individualism and the ability to thrive in challenging environments.
The late 1950s and early 1960s saw the beginnings of the modern environmental movement. Awareness of nature and the wilderness grew, partly in response to increasing industrialization and urbanization. The period saw a growing interest in realistic fiction and stories that dealt with human experiences and emotions in a straightforward manner. Survival stories provided a compelling way to explore themes of human endurance, courage, and the relationship between humans and nature. Authors like Jack London, who had written earlier about survival in the wilderness, experienced a resurgence in popularity, influencing contemporary writers.
Other popular man versus nature narratives that emerged at the same time were Lord of the Flies in 1954, which was a novel that explores the descent into savagery of a group of boys stranded on a deserted island and reflected concerns about human nature and societal breakdown resonating with Cold War anxieties. My Side of the Mountain in 1959 by Jean Craighead George, which is a novel about a boy who leaves New York City to live in the Catskill Mountains. It captures the desire for self-reliance and connection with nature, themes central to many survival narratives. And finally and funnily, popular TV shows such as Gilligan's Island from 1964 to 1967, which revolved around the theme of survival on a deserted island. So this was also just to environmentalism and Cold War anxieties. So the book kind of comes at a time when our imagination, and keep in mind, if we remember from the Buffy St. Marie episode, as we get into the 60s, there's also started to be a renewed interest in Native American culture and all the things.
Right.
So,
Island of the Blue Dolphins has not been without significant criticisms, however. Here we go. Trisha Light, in an article for California Voices, puts it plainly, quote, "Historical inaccuracy aside, Odell, who was white, told a story about violence against Native Californians, but he highlighted a statistical anomaly. A massacre committed on Native Californians by other Native people during a century marked by a genocide from American colonizers in the region."
In an essay in American Indians in Children's Literature, quote, "Odell had little to go on in creating the worldview of Corona and her people. To flesh out the story, he inserted his prior research on other California tribes, inserting their ways into the Nicoleno tribe as though one people's way of being was interchangeable with another. He also drew from popular stereotypes and cliches of American Indians, including the stories in which American Indians traded their land for a string of beads. An American embrace of stereotypes and cliches led to and guaranteed the success of the novel."
Island of the Blue Dolphins is a lot like most books and media about American Indians that give the audience the kind of Indians that America loves to love. Odell gave us both. The savage ones, the Aleuts, and the gentle ones, Karana's people. There's a fascination, a nostalgia, and a yearning for the romantic Indian and all that, quote, Indian means to people who think the best life anyone could have is one of the Indian of yesteryear, living in the pristine wilderness where the weight of the world is not on your shoulders, where you can breathe clean air and drink clean water.
The quote goes on, "This nostalgia also captures the imaginings of the perfect childhood, but neither one is or was real. As such, Island of the Blue Dolphins is a perfect example of a book at the center of the canon of sentiment. Indeed, the canon of sentiment, quote, exists to preserve the childhood of those adults who create that canon and to preserve the affection those adults feel for the books within it," unquote. A good many adults imagine the childhood Odell described and the survival that Karana experienced. We like to think we could survive too, and a story like this one lets us see how that could happen.
More importantly, the novel and the story of the lone woman of San Nicolas appeal to the American desire to romanticize the vanishing Indian. From the History of the White House website.
During the 19th century, Americans embraced a larger theme in artwork, literature, and political rhetoric, which historians call the myth of the vanishing Indian. This trope posited that Native Americans were doomed to extinction. According to historian Paul Gentz, white Americans felt the deaths of indigenous individuals, quote, could be mourned, unquote, while simultaneously believing that, quote, Indians must die away into the untrodden West as white civilization took its racially superior place on the continent, unquote. In reality, Native Americans were not vanishing. They were being displaced by war and coercion and dispossessed of their ancestral lands through illegal seizures and illegitimate treaty negotiations.
The myth of the vanishing Indian was a national, self-fulfilling prophecy pursued by federal government officials and agents throughout the 19th century that aligned with a wider belief in manifest destiny, or the idea that American territorial expansion by white settlers was both inevitable and preordained by God. This behavior was supported by federal legislation throughout the century, reaching its zenith when President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. At his annual message to Congress,
quote from Jackson, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching a happy consummation. Rightly considered, the policy of the general government toward the red man is not only liberal, but generous. He is unwilling to submit to the laws of the states and mingle with their population. To save him from this alternative, or perhaps utter annihilation, the general government kindly offers him a new home."
what a swell fucking guy, that genocidal piece of shit.
Yeah.
Here, the myth of the vanishing Indian is evident. Jackson claims that removal will, quote, save Native Americans from, quote, utter annihilation, when in fact, his policies exacerbated the problem. Despite claims that these removal policies were, quote, generous, Jackson's plans led to unimaginable suffering among indigenous groups, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole peoples. These efforts were continued by Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, who oversaw the forced removal of the Cherokee people to Oklahoma in 1838 to 1839, more commonly known as the Trail of Tears. Native Americans were also aware of the existence of this myth and its impact on their lives. In 1829, an article in the Cherokee Phoenix noted,
quote, "It is frequently said that the Indians are given up to destruction, that it is the will of heaven that they should become extinct and give way to the white man. Those who assert this doctrine seem to act towards these unfortunate people in a consistent manner, either in neglecting them entirely or endeavoring to hasten the period of their extinction." So, a couple things to note. There's not a lot of records around why the Nicoleno were taken in 1835. But what that coincided with was Spain secularizing the missions. California, they were called Californios. The Spaniards that lived in California were considered themselves sort of distinct from Mexicans, like that were in Mexico. And they had big, huge ranches. And 1838, Trail of Tears, 1835, there's some suggestion that there's sort of this mandate, get them all out of there so that we can just rape the land of their resources. We want the sea otters. So let's just get them the fuck out of there, right? And there was also, I went over this last week, sort of California policy. I was like my Kamala Harris impersonation. California policy was that if you found natives, I mean, you could just turn them into slaves. Like, you could just do that, you know? But the story was like, oh, benevolent missionaries are like, you got to go get these. There's like 10 people left on this island. You have to go get them. It's far more likely the original scenario, which is someone landed there, grabbed a girl, and was like, hey, guys, free slaves, go get them. Get them while they're hot. But it was taking place in a time when like this was just part and parcel. It was your right as a white person to enslave anybody you wanted to, you know,
Wow.
and you were doing them a favor, you know.
That is how all of this is framed.
Yeah. Like I said, because I think people have trouble understanding the vanishing Indian thing, where it's like, it's not acknowledging that we have genocided these people. It's completely depersonalizing. It's like man killed by gunfire.
Yes.
In shootout with police. It's like man killed by police is the direct way to say what you're saying. And it's the same thing where it's like, well, it's inevitable. Like their way of life. It's like this idea that if Americans had not landed here, that Native Americans would have still like just vanished because
they had a vanishing disease that just took them.
Yeah. So, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, yeah, the land was theirs, but like they're not using it. Like they're not building castles on it. Okay. They're not destroying the soil by over farming it. they're not using it, guys. And that's kind of the other argument for genocide is it's like they were never there. Okay, if they were there, like they weren't using it.
Mhm.
Right? It's like that's like in that kind of thing that Dr. Tallbear went over. It's like there's these 5 phases of like justifying extermination. And so the big one is, yeah, the natives were here, but like they weren't using it effectively. Like, you know, don't you
Mhm.
like having like a car and like a house? You want to be living in a fucking teepee? Do you want to be living in a hut of whale bones? Like that's kind of the
Yeah.
right? It's
The
like
cognitive dissonance there is just sharp.
yeah. Okay. As a final denouement, Island of the Blue Dolphins was made into a film. And we're going to watch and I want, as we watch this, and it's fully narrated because it's a film from the 60s. So as far as trailers go, it's pretty like I'm going to read you the back of the book. But I want you just to think about the last 2 episodes and what the story we've told you about Juana. And then by the time it trickles down into popular culture, what it looks like. So I want you to like hold that in your mind. All right, let us play. Take a shot every time you see someone in red face.
From one of the best-loved and inspiring novels of recent years, The Island of the Blue Dolphins, comes a vivid and memorable motion picture. Widely read, The Island of the Blue Dolphins has won 5 major awards. The coveted Newbery Medal, the Rupert Hughes Award, the Hans Christian Andersen Award, the William Allen White Award, the Berlin Book Award. Now, Island of the Blue Dolphins becomes one of the warmest, most exciting adventures based on a true experience ever brought to the screen.
Ramo! My brother! He's still on the island! Corona!
Abandoned on a remote island, like Robinson Crusoe, she fought loneliness, terror, and danger. In the process, she turned desolation into an island paradise. You love the birds, the dolphins, the baby seal she befriends.
We will bring fresh fish to you every day and come and visit you every day so you will not be lonely.
You'll be touched as she makes and loses a friend from another tribe, another distant world.
I cannot go with you. Not with the men who killed my father.
You'll thrill to the excitement of the burning of the village, the attack of the wolf dogs, the battle between bow and arrow and the attacking guns of the Aleut invader.
Bursting with excitement.
Yeah.
A motion picture
I
the
love-
entire
Do you like
family
dolphins?
can
Do you like
enjoy
baby
together.
seals? Do you like puppies? Do you like dogs?
Oh my god. Yeah, that was definitely a snapshot of the 60s.
Yeah. So like,
Feel better right away.
but seeing
He is the
like
God who...
I said at the beginning, like take a shot every time you see someone in red face, right? It's like,
Too.
but you see this complete kind of see the excitement of the burning village. It's like, you mean when we exterminated these people? It's like,
Yeah,
it's
thrill
so
in it, no less. Thrill
Yeah.
in the excitement.
yeah, and just the complete kind of romanticizing of what it's like to live off of the land, right? You know, baby
She was
seals.
very much a Disney princess with her little bird on her arm.
Yeah. So the film was released in 1964, starring Celia Kay, who claimed and was promoted as being part Cherokee because, you know, they're all the same. She went on, I believe, to win the Golden Globe for Best New Actress. To date, no record of her Cherokee heritage has been found. A delightful cherry on the Sunday of whitewashing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the story of Juana Maria and Island of the Blue Dolphins. And not to update. Dun, 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 unsolved mystery. Dun, 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 dun. I can't do the unsolved mysteries music. Anyway. So 4 years there was some degree of variance. I went through and looked at actual newspaper articles, pretty contemporary to when all this stuff happened. So here's what we do know. It was said that all of the Nicoleno that were removed from the island perished before Juana Maria was brought to Santa Barbara in 1853. So the accepted lore was that all the Nicoleno died within like a year or two of arriving, so that when Juana Maria got there was no one left. She was the last one. That is not true. They have found at least one person that survived, went on to get married, have kids, lived in Los Angeles. There is most certainly other survivors. They also discovered through different records that they found recently that, like I said earlier, they did find other Nicoleno people, and they did find other natives that could communicate with her, which is why we know everything that was in that Scribner's article in terms of like what she did while she was there and all of that kind of stuff. So the second mystery was she a mother? Was there a baby? Did she jump off the ship? Did she just not get to the ship? She was not alone for 18 years.
Huh.
She had a son. This was communicated to other natives. She had a son that was left on the island. She dove in after him. She got there and she found him, and they lived together on the island for many, many, many years until he was attacked by a shark and killed while hunting.
Oh, wow.
So that is that mystery. So she actually wasn't alone the whole time. She was there with her child. And that makes a lot more sense in terms of running away from people and not wanting to leave, is that she was there with her son. They were fine. So that is that follow-up. So there are most likely, I started looking around on Ancestry and I found Tomas, who did marry and have children. I haven't looked further, but it's very likely that there are probably hundreds now of descendants from Nicoleno natives that were assimilated through the missionary system or through marriage. So she was not the last by any means. Yeah. And excavations continue on the island. It went on to be like a naval testing thing for a while. Now it is mainly used by researchers that are interested in biodiversity and marine conservation. They keep uncovering like artifacts. They found her cave recently with all of her stuff still intact. They also unearthed like thousands of skeletons that were super old. So there had been like a previous population on the island that had died through some sort of massacre. So they're still kind of dating all of that stuff. But yeah, that is the story of Juana Maria.
That was such a fascinating and infuriating, frequently, story. And I'm really, really glad to learn about it from you. This has been incredibly informative, if, very heart-wrenching. So thank you so much for bringing this to our audience and to me, your co-host, and to the world. That's really good.
Yes. Shall we do some housekeeping?
Let's do some housekeeping.
Okay.
I just want to extend personal, heartfelt gratitude to our patrons who throw a coin to us, who toss a little into our tip jar. Eric Anderson, MCF, Covenant TG, my homie Seth, Nick P, John Johns, Ms. Mary Cunningham, Mr. Yella DeShriver, Beth Ann Cagney, and Anna Everett. Y'all are the fucking realest. We are so grateful.
All right, bye guys. All right, I'm gonna stop recording.